Welcome to the Euro Express with me, your host, Kevin Turley. On this show, we climb aboard the Euro Express to visit different European locations where we talk to people living there about their lives and their faith. It's as if we're hurtling through Europe in the dining compartment of the Orient Express with good food and even better conversation. So, all aboard the Euro Express. Hello, today on the Euro Express we collect Ryan Christopher, ADF International's London man, and head to Vienna where we meet his colleague Lois McLatchie, who works in the communications department at ADF International in Vienna. Ryan, Lois, welcome on board the Euro Express.
Thank you, it's great to be here.
Same.
Now, Lois, you're involved in communications. My first question to you is, how do you communicate with an audience which is at best indifferent and often hostile to the message of ADF, which is about family, which is about life, and which is about values which European societies, many European societies, have decided to reject?
Thanks for that question. So ADF International at core is about protecting fundamental freedoms and human dignity of all people. So actually that is a very holistic message that a lot of people can get behind. When we speak about fundamental freedoms, we're talking about defending people out in Asia who are persecuted for their faith. Or we're talking about protecting lives who would be discriminated against because they are female or because they are disabled. So what we do is actually something that's based in the fundamentals of the human rights dialogue, which a lot of people do support. So it's just about showing that this is a message that everybody does want to get behind.
Absolutely. Ryan, would it be fair to say, or is it a caricature, that the UK is probably the most unreceptive country in Europe to your message?
I would love to claim that, Kevin, and I definitely think it's in the top 5. Everyone likes that victim complex, right? Especially nowadays. But no, I don't think it is. I think we're up there on some issues. I think places like Holland are probably just as bad in lots of ways, if I'm being frank. But I'm not saying that because I'm proud of the UK. I'm not. I think we're about as bad as it gets. I think the flip side to that is that if people can get it right in the UK, if we can re-evangelize the United Kingdom, if we can have a culture of life again, I think the UK is probably the best place to try and blueprint what that would look like for the rest of the West.
Yes. Now, the ADF International and both of you work on many different levels. So, for example, Lois, I know that you've worked with the UN, and I know both of you in different ways work with political entities, be they the British Parliament or the European Parliament or other national bodies and institutions. Talk to me a little bit about what it's like communicating your message within those fora. Lois.
Sure, you're absolutely right. We do work at the institutional level. We like to target the root causes of discriminatory law at the very source. And that's why you find ADF International team members at the UN and at the EU and different places. It is a hostile environment often for our messages that are about protecting life and protecting values that support life. And often we find that countries around the world who do hold values that are family-oriented, that support life from conception till natural death, often we find that they are under pressure at the UN and the institutional level because of their beliefs. And there's language put forward, we talk about communicative language, and that's kind of to say that prioritizing reproductive rights or women's rights and pretending that these go against the rights of children and babies, and that states cannot maintain their pro-life laws without sacrificing these somehow. And that's just not the case. And a lot of our work at these institutional levels is communicating to states that that isn't the case, that they can defend life, that they can protect the human rights of their citizens from conception till natural death. And they have the arguments to do that. So there is no human right to abortion, but there is a human right to life. And by telling them those messages, those things that they can take into negotiating rooms, they're able to protect their beliefs and accurately represent their cultures that have put them in a place of representation.
Ryan, the the whole business of language, which is how we communicate, is political and contentious, especially so in the UK at the moment. So, I mean, how do you actually have a discussion if you don't actually agree some of the meaning of the words?
I think we have a real problem with language right now, Kevin. I think C.S. Lewis said in the 30s, maybe 40s, that we've lost a common vocabulary of reason in society. And if he was worried about that in the 30s, then I think we should be worried about that now. And that's what I'm seeing. Not only is it a vocabulary of reason in the sense that I think a logical argument doesn't count for much anymore. I think also what words really mean has been lost a lot of that time. And that's partly because of education, and it's partly because words have been spun to mean what they are not, or at times the exact opposite of what they are. I think the word dignity has been spun somewhat in recent years to great effect, since the 90s, for example. So I think there's that issue of language on both those levels. And I think as a result of that, the generation we're trying to communicate to, I'd say from my age range down, right, mid-30s down in particular, it's a language of emotion, and it's a language of empathy, and it's a language of image and face in particular. And whilst as a former educator, I might regret that lowering of standards, for want of a better term, and I regret that we can't have reasoned dialogue in quite the same way as maybe we once did, I don't know, the 20s, if C.S. Lewis was complaining then. I think we have a duty to tap into where people are at, and a lot of the time that involves people and stories at the heart of it.
Absolutely, but Lewis, you're a communications specialist. You know, that's your trade. You know, words and communications. But Ryan makes a very important point there, which in some ways the whole communications industry, and I use that term very loosely, has kind of devalued communication often, because what we get is a lot of spin, a lot of fabrication, and sometimes downright untruths. So, I mean, how do you operate in ADF differently to that as a communications professional?
I think one of the ways to kind of cut through all this spin is to have genuine testimonies from people who can share their story of how they've been discriminated against or how they've experienced an injustice, and show that this is a real thing that is happening to real people. So one example of that is in the UK, well, there's a case that's actually going to the European Court of Human Rights at the moment. And it's with regard to censorship zones outside of abortion clinics.
Do you want to explain to our audience a little bit of the history of that? Because I think it's very interesting, Lois.
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to. So back when this case began, there was a lady called Alina.
That's right.
And she had been abandoned by her boyfriend when she found out that she was pregnant. And she felt that she had nowhere to turn. She felt that she didn't have financial support, she didn't have her family's support, and she didn't know what to do. She called up the abortion clinic and she said, I need some help. And they said, all we can offer you is an abortion. So not having any other choices, Elena went along to the clinic. But fortunately, before she even went in, she met with somebody who was outside the clinic, and she said, I need some help. And they offered her that help. They offered her financial help. They offered her material care for her and her child. And they gave her a real choice that she could have her baby and she could make that exciting step into motherhood. And today she's the proud mother of a beautiful little girl. But Alina, all she needed was some help. And somebody was there to offer her. However, unfortunately, the borough of London, where that abortion clinic was situated, said that they couldn't offer that help anymore and had banned and censored anyone from being able to stand outside the clinic and be able to partake in such counselling, or partake in prayer, or partake in offering any alternative. So Alina is off to the European Court of Human Rights to challenge this so that other mothers can receive the options and care that they need to continue their pregnancies. So what you see with Alina's story is that by putting a human face, by putting a human lady who just needed some help that we can identify with, that we can imagine ourselves being, we're able to communicate that message of hope, but of concern for other women and babies in a way that is relatable and a way that gets our message across to the right people. So I think that's the power of testimony. To answer your question, I think stories are really critical to sharing our message.
I couldn't agree more, and I've actually interviewed Alina, and I think her story is incredibly powerful. But Ryan, being the devil's advocate, I mean, where do you start in the UK where the debate is sort of censored? I mean, people can't literally pray outside that place, not just give out leaflets or offer help or offer advice to people, but you can't even, legally, you can't even pray outside it. I mean, where do you start?
Yeah, I think there are two avenues on an issue such as buffer zones or censorship zones, as we feel they should be called. I think the first is that there are some real liberals left in the UK, right? So I think many people talk about this being a post-liberal age, and I feel very strongly that it is. And I think the liberals are going to get eaten along with the Christians if they're not careful and they don't fight on the same ground for rationality and language that's objective and things like that, of course. But I think the real liberals that are still left, the decision makers in government, members of parliament, members of the established media, and others who have some influence, I think there are enough of them to have a voice still. And I think there are secular pro-choice organisations such as the Manifesto Club, who are a fantastic organisation, Liberty UK. You don't get much more, liberal, progressive than Liberty. Peter Tatchell, a well-known LGBT campaigner. All of these people have come out against the censorship zone that Lois has referred to. Why? Because it's disproportionate and it's illiberal. It might be progressive. It might pander to a very small element of a base on one side of the debate, which I'm afraid a lot of policy and politics is doing right now. But it leaves an awful lot of genuine liberals out. And so there's a coalition there to be built and fostered, along with, I think, Christians like ourselves who are reasonable, who are happy to form those coalitions for those purposes.
I mean, I think that's a really interesting point, Ryan, and it reshapes the sort of debate within our society, that it's not simply the Christians versus the rest, but it's people who value freedom and freedom of speech, freedom of expression. But I think as well, what it's also shining the light on is the authoritarian nature of some of these decision making, and also the rather, I mean, you and I will both know the rather shoddy way in which that decision was made to implement this law, and it was made with a seeming complete disregard to one side of the community who were actually saying that there was no problem with this, and in fact it was a good service to be had. But I mean, you are coming up against an ideology which, if you like, censors debate, doesn't want to have discussion. Lois, you're in the business of communication. I mean, this isn't just a UK problem, but across Europe, there are people who want to close down debate, who want to not just censor debate, but not have any debate on certain subjects. The matter is settled as far as they're concerned. How do you sort of prise open that mind or that ability to have a discourse when so many minds appear to be closed at the moment?
It's true, there is increasing censorship and we see it unfold across Europe. And I think the one anecdote is really the clients that we represent at ADF International and others who are courageously speaking out and taking their cases forward and saying that enough is enough. If I think of an example in Finland right now, we're representing a lady who was the former Minister of the Interior.
Yes.
She is now...
Do you want to say a little bit about that? Because I think that's a fascinating case, Lois.
I would love to, yeah. And I think it really demonstrates how people can speak out against this intolerance, against Christian ideas. So this lady, Päivi Räsänen, was a former politician. She's now a grandmother and she's a pastor's wife. And she tweeted her own church leadership and questioned them as to why they decided to sponsor the local Pride parade in 2019. And along with the tweet, she had attached a image with a Bible verse in the image. Now, Päivi faced police investigation for sending that tweet to her own church leadership.
That's right.
It's absolutely outrageous. And Päivi has faced subsequent police investigations for leaflets that she wrote over 20 years ago.
That's right.
That just simply defend a Christian worldview. So we're representing Päivi, and by highlighting her story and making it known both in Finland but at the institutions where ADF is present, we're able to show how ridiculous this censorship, this cancel culture has gotten. And through her story, we're able to open doors of advocacy, whether it's in Scotland, who are also facing their own hate crime bill, which could result in some severe censorship for the Scottish people. That's my nationality, where I'm from. My family would be finding those censorship laws very difficult, or whether it's Malta, where they're facing a bill which could severely restrict their speech and their freedom to express their beliefs. So again, it's the stories and the people who are bold enough to speak out.
But Ryan, I mean, we have examples in the UK. Sometimes they're rather ridiculous examples that don't end up going very far. But we have had street preachers, for example, in London, a number of them, arrested for simply reading passages from the New Testament out on the street. Now, whether this was overzealous police officers or underinformed police officers or community support officers or whatever they were doing this sort of thing, but it still sends a message. And I know that the Finnish case is a very important one because of the message it's sending to the wider community, that there are certain subjects that you shouldn't discuss or shouldn't have a view on other than the orthodox one determined by the state. I mean, in the UK in particular, the Scottish, you might want to tell our viewers a little bit about the Scottish hate bill, which has caused a lot of concern for not just Christians, but for anybody who values free speech.
Yeah, I think the real danger in the Scottish hate bill is the same root cause for a lot of the chilling effect that you've just alluded to there, Kevin. And that is the fact that it's really broadly worded. And, you know, for the most part, the law on freedom of speech in the UK and Scotland, as it stands, isn't terrible. You know, it isn't terrible. You compare it to some other parts of Europe or other parts of the world. But the problem is there's an awful lot of scope in broadly worded law, the bad law that is there, and in particular, the law that regulates a lot of our public interaction with each other in the streets, the Public Order Act in particular. And there's an awful lot of discretion that law enforcement officers and others at times have to interpret whether an activity is something that falls foul of that law, is creating a public order issue. So the root of it is poorly drafted law. And we'll come back to the Scottish hate crime bill proposal in a moment to look at that in more detail. But I think the real issue that needs tackling then is, while we have these broadly worded laws that give police such discretion, then it really is on the government and on training and on the rest of society to hold law enforcement organisations, the CPS and others to account, to make sure that they're not being overzealous and imposing one ideology over another, where the law gives that space. I think what we have seen is the imposition of particular rights over others in practice by the police. I think we've seen that on the issue of transgender speech online in particular. It goes beyond the law as it's written. And we've seen it, I think, in practice on the streets, speaking of a Christian ideology of anthropology, for example.
I mean, Ryan, you make a very interesting point, but what you also show, which is true of the United Kingdom, I'm not sure of other countries, but is that sometimes there is a muddy, a sort of woolly thinking in the law enforcement agencies involved in this, because generally in society, it's not so much a woolly thinking as a desire not to offend, or maybe an oversensitivity or a sort of half-formed idea that this is not something that we can say. Which leads me to the question, again, back to the Scottish hate bill, because once something is enacted in law, it has a certain force which people can point to and people can interpret. Now, badly drafted laws are the bane of society and a great boost to lawyers. But with the Scottish hate bill in particular, is it in some ways just adding to the confusion around this rather than clarifying it? What do you think, Ryan?
There's no doubt that the bill, particularly as initially drafted and intended by the SNP up in Scotland, was going to add confusion rather than clarity. There would have been very simple ways of tidying up the law in Scotland that would have dealt very directly with some of the issues that they wanted to deal with, if it was really about speech that incites hate or violence, right?
Sure.
I think that's traditionally what we've understood hate speech to do, or hate crime to be. It's a crime like assault, where you have an uplift in sentencing for example, where it was motivated by an animosity towards a particular characteristic of a person. That isn't difficult to do in the law, to make those kind of things clear.
And exists anyway under the criminal code, correct?
It does exist anyway under the criminal code. It's been fairly long-standing in the UK in different ways, in different jurisdictions, right? But I think that's left the SNP up in Scotland open to accusations that this is, in fact, a blasphemy law. It's a complete reversal of what was once in Scotland, which is that anyone dissenting from a certain ideology and a kind of Puritan settlement on a particular issue, it's off with their heads, and they're not to be tolerated. And not only, the issue with the Scottish hate crime bill wasn't just that I can't say things, it's I can't own material in my own home that others could find hateful or insightful of hate. That's extraordinary. And, on the way it was initially drafted, especially, you could see complaint-driven police entry into Christian homes to look for material that they've been accused of having that could be found hateful by other people. That would make Scotland something of a standout, even within Europe, which at times can be really bad on the speech issue.
But I mean, just taking the logical, I was going to say logical conclusion, the illogical conclusion of where that ends up. I mean, anybody with an internet has access to any amount of information which may be deemed to be hateful or whatever. I mean, most people don't sit with large libraries in their homes anymore. They have the internet where they access information. Lois, where do you start with the Scottish Parliament then in your sort of work? I mean, where something is so sort of illogical, could end up with any amount of legal challenge, rightly so maybe, but also cause a lot of distress to a great number of ordinary people that may hold Christian views or just liberal views about certain matters.
Well, you really touched on something important at the end there already, and I think from a communications perspective, when presenting these arguments to the Scottish Parliament, a really important part of our work has been showing that it's not only Christians who would be suffering under a restriction of speech. Some feminists were very worried that their views would be shut out from a societal mainstream.
Yes.
Humanists also joined it was called the Free to Disagree campaign in Scotland, which was a union of many different actors. And they were very concerned. The police union, one of the unions of policemen, were concerned that they wouldn't know how to deal with a situation where someone might be guilty of a hate crime, but they're not sure. So all of these actors came together for a campaign in Scotland that was very unified. And I think that sent a very clear message that this is not just Christians at it again with their advocacy. This is a real issue that would really impact the lives of people in Scotland all over. I think another good way for the media to use personal stories in that instance was there was a lot of discussion at the time around J.K. Rowling and what she'd been saying in the Twitter and the cancel culture that had come after her for her views on biological sex. And in the media, it was communicated that she herself could face penalty or even imprisonment in the original bill for 7 years for having tweeted something that could be interpreted as stirring up hate. So having a personal face that people could recognise as someone who would be falling victim of this bill is a very effective way to communicate both to parliamentarians and to the public.
Do you find, Ryan, that in the UK that some of these cases make an awful lot of noise, first of all on Twitter, inevitably, and then they end up on the front pages of various tabloid newspapers, and then they get a bit of a soundbite, but actually most of them don't actually go very far?
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about people being initially arrested or charged under public order offences or other kind of hate crime related offences, yeah, that's true. If you look at the statistics, an awful lot of people don't end up getting successful prosecuted. And as you've alluded to before, I think certain activists who work on these issues, who would like to create a Puritan style environment in our democracy, they're very happy with that. That's exactly what they intend, and that's why they propose broadly worded laws. I think the other aspect to add to that is whilst they don't go very far, amongst the people that matter, it hits home, because I think there was a poll only a couple of days ago that dissected who's most active on social media, and activists who are left-leaning and often progressive on the issues that this show would be interested in, let's put it in those terms, 13% of the population put out a vast majority of the social media noise that goes on to something like Twitter. And that helps them explain why, despite these cases maybe not ending in prosecution, they get far more magnification than their due based on the facts.
Absolutely. Now, you touch on an interesting point, though, that we live in a social media age, but we still have a very dominant media. And the media does shape debates. It shapes the news narrative. It shapes political narrative. And it also, to some extent, shapes the cultures we live in. Now, the ADF, obviously, you're working across Europe with intergovernmental bodies and national bodies, etc. But how do you start to infiltrate or penetrate the kind of media groupspeak that we have certainly in the UK, I'm sure it's the same in other developed European, Western European countries, which naturally inclines against or naturally repels the types of arguments that ADF International are making around family life, around life in general? Lois?
Well, I think, again, in that case, the key is finding common ground. So one particularly effective strategy is, instead of perhaps going straight after saying nobody should have an abortion, what we can instead frame it as is, don't you think that babies with a club foot or a cleft palate or who have Down syndrome should have the same right to life as babies who don't have disabilities? And most people would say, yes, of course I think that. I would never discriminate against someone because of their disability. So there we've opened a conversation about when is discrimination ever appropriate? And we can say, well, certainly not before birth, and that's what's happening right here in the UK. Already, you're able to be aborted up to 40 weeks if you have a disability. Yeah. And most people would agree that that is completely wrong. So we can start there and start the conversation opening there. And get to where we want to go.
Well, I mean, I'm all for common ground, as are you, Lois. But I mean, the ADF's work goes from the far highlands of Scotland all the way down to the Urals. And I mean, Europe is a huge entity with extremely diverse cultures, with different histories, different religions sometimes, different understandings of what it is, different legal systems. I was going to say different understandings of family and life, but I would actually say that's one of the commonalities we probably have across Europe traditionally. But we definitely have different legal systems and different ways of interacting. I mean, for example, can you see the sort of Scottish hate bill being enacted in Italy, for example, or in the Balkans? I mean, so my question really is, how do you make yourself relevant as a pan-European organisation dealing with very complex and very difficult issues, but across a continent which is so diverse in so many ways?
You're absolutely right. The people and the clients that we deal with are all from different nationalities and come from different cultures. I do think that, particularly with the example you brought up of hate speech, that is something that all Europeans are facing to some extent in one way or another. And I think a lot of these laws that we're seeing in Scotland, in Malta, in Finland are actually, there's a lot of common ground between them. So they are facing the same challenges. But the difference is in how we communicate effectively in those regions. And I think it's critical that we have representatives from each of these nations who are able to communicate a message that is culturally relevant. So that's why, as an organization, we're not just an in-house legal team, but we actually have a network of allies of over 4,000 attorneys and other people who we are able to support either with funding or with legal support or spiritual support or in any other way. And we're able to get to the right places and meet the right people in order that we can have those stories, those local stories from individuals on the ground who have been affected by these hate speech laws or whatever it is. We're able to amplify them with our international platform.
Do you find that, Ryan, that although you're based in London heading up the ADF International operation there, that really your work at the moment is as pan-European as if you were based in Brussels or Vienna?
Yeah, at times it is, Kevin. And I think the value of us being pan-European and worldwide, actually. We're in India, we're in New York, we're in all sorts of places. I think the value of that is that I think for the last 25 years, the top-down cultural shift And we can talk about language, we can talk about how we understand family, we can talk about how we understand what women's rights really looks like. That top-down cultural shift has been institution down onto the people. I think a lot of Europeans in lots of countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, I think, as we've seen in recent elections, feel that there's been something of an agenda imposed upon them from the outside.
Yes.
And on the Christian side, on the kind of historical Christian side of these issues, there hasn't been an organization that has managed to join up all of these institutions that give the top-down pressure on language and life and practice and law in a way that ADF has. And that was the real need for ADF International. And I think it's also given an awful lot of confidence to allies on the ground in local nationalities that they know, whether it be at the UN or whether it be at the European Court of Human Rights, that they have something of a big ally, a big, strong ally who's looking out for them in a way that I don't think they had 15 years ago,
yes,
in that pan-European, pan-world sense.
I would agree, and I'd go further and say that, I mean, your arrival in London is relatively recent in a sense, but it makes a difference just knowing that you're working there. I mean, is that in a sense what it boils down to, do you think, in a way that in the past we've maybe conceded too much to other ideologies because they're just well organized, and we have been rather on the back foot or rather shambolic in how we've actually sort of embraced the process, both politically, in terms of media, legally as well?
100%, Kevin. I couldn't agree with that more. Very small numbers of people can change the world, and very small numbers of people can definitely change the culture, particularly when it comes to making regulation change, and then that shifting culture in things like educational institutions, for example. So, I mean, you can chart the change in, let's take education as an example in the UK. Mm-hmm. In the last decade, there's been a radical shift in what the Department for Education have said is normative for schools to be doing and how broad their remit is. And you can chart that, give or take, to particular ministers going into position, and then particular members of NGOs who want to pursue certain agendas, getting positions within the Department for Education, places like Ofsted and others. And then, lo and behold, 6-7 years later, we see RSE regulation as we do now, yes, which strips parents of an awful lot of the rights that they would have enjoyed only a year or two ago, without any question. So I think people who aren't involved in the human rights NGO world, who aren't involved in policy world, who aren't based here in Westminster, are blissfully unaware of just how small the number of people are that are reshaping our culture in a really radical way. And for me, that's unfortunate, because that's not what our political system is designed to enable. But it's all about immediate access to particular departments of government, in my experience.
Yes, and it sort of reminds us all that most revolutions are started by only a handful of people, and so absolutely. But Lois, I mean, you know, talking of common ground, I mean, we are discussing freedom of religion, we're discussing freedom of speech, we're freedom of expression, freedom of conscience, even in certain workplaces for people. And the key word is freedom. And I'm just wondering if in an age where seems to be such a creeping authoritarianism, as Ryan's alluding to, the top-down approach, is that one of the common grounds that you think there is? That this idea that all human beings ultimately wish to be free, to be able to freely choose how to live, within reason, of course, but that freedom is one of those commonalities that we all crave, and something very attractive in an age which is increasingly illiberal.
Of course, yeah. Freedom is central to who we are, who we're created to be as human beings. And I think one of the reasons why we're at the national level, at the institutional level, is to ensure that there is no overstep, there is no creep of an agenda that is implemented from on high, from UN agencies, from government agencies, that would stop a person being able to live according to their conscience, whether that's you know, a midwife who needs to conduct her career according to her conscience, a baker who needs to be able to fulfill orders according to his conscience. We all have to be free to be able to live out our firmly, deeply held beliefs. And that's a right that's enshrined in international law, that's agreed by fundamental human rights principles. And that's what we're here to defend.
But when you
And
were
I think part of the, sorry, Kevin, I think
okay.
part of the cultural issue here is that freedom has got a bad rap, I think, in the last 5 years.
Yes.
If I look at Twitter, for example, as my barometer of how the influencers and decision makers are seeing things like freedom, I think any attempt by an individual or a group or a church to assert their right to be free to do something when it isn't even especially harmful of another person, I think is lazily, and actually not lazily most of the time, very intentionally branded as some kind of extreme libertarianism. And I think being able to separate one understanding of libertarianism from what true freedom looks like is a crisis both within the church and without the church, both at the same time. And I think if I look at the way that most young people are educated in or out of Christian schools, there isn't an awful lot of time spent on being able to parse out an understanding of what freedom really is, what the appropriate boundaries of that, what's the root and source of our freedom, and what's it for ultimately, right? What's that freedom to be used in pursuit of? And so I think as Christians, we have an awful lot to make up in terms of that ground in educating people in what a healthy freedom looks like.
I mean, absolutely. But Lewis, I mean, when you were working at the United Nations, I mean, and you're rightly saying that everybody wants to be free, everybody wants to enjoy freedom. But did the sort of diplomats and the people you were working with, or did they actually understand the term freedom in the same sense? I mean, there may be a gut reaction that we all have that, yes, we want to be free. But ultimately, were they able to understand what it means to be free? And what that freedom actually entails, which is, as Ryan's alluding to, it's much more about duties and about being part of a human society and not just simply sort of being on your own and doing whatever you like.
Yeah, I think you're right, there was definite confusion at the UN amongst diplomats and as we see in our culture today about freedom often was equated at the UN to being the same as autonomy. Is the same as bodily rights and being able to do whatever you want with your body, no matter how it affects anyone else. And that is not a way that a society can function. That is not a free society if by exercising one's bodily autonomy, they can end the life of another. So there was a huge confusion in a way that word was communicated. And part of our role as advocates was to parse that out and explain that human rights are fundamental, indivisible, and are applied to each person. And exercising one's bodily autonomy has to be done within the constraints of one's own human dignity and everyone else's human dignity. And those two could not be overstepped.
Would you say, Ryan, that the UK is, when you're working with the British Parliament, that the parliamentarians there are open and receptive to your discussions around these sorts of issues? We've recently, in the last 12 months, had an election. We have a new intake in Parliament. We are bombarded with other problems at the current time. But when you sit down with them, either in the lobbies or meet with them privately, are you able to actually have a discussion which they understand your meanings of freedom and can have some empathy with that?
I think it's rare that I would sit down with an MP who understands my Catholic understanding of freedom in a holistic way, right? So at that level, insofar as this is a show that Catholics are going to watch, very few of them would get that and be able to, I think, teach someone else the Catholic understanding of freedom and how that applies to individuals and human society. And I think very related to that, the notion of the common good has been skewed and misused an awful lot in the last 10 years in particular. I'll say that as an aside. I think for the broader sense of freedom, that freedom isn't just a kind of selfish, extreme libertarianism. There is an awful, I think that probably the vast majority of the House, if they were being honest with a friend over a pint, would actually agree that freedom is a good thing. I do really believe that. I think an awful lot are confused ideologically as to how you maybe, how do I hold that exactly alongside one understanding of socialism or more radical socialism? I think a lot of them haven't really thought this through. But I think there's a quiet majority that would see freedom as a fundamentally good thing, and an awful lot who would be very strongly in favor of our understanding of freedom, who might not say it on the floor of the house, but like I say, when the door is closed with a friend, they might elucidate that opinion.
Now, both of you are Christians working in the public square. It's probably too much to expect parliamentarians, wherever they are, to have a full Christian understanding of society. Some do, undoubtedly. Many don't, unfortunately. But it seems to be a never-ending, I think one author described it as a never-ending defeat, that the Christian values, the Judeo-Christian basis on which Western society has been built seems to constantly be under attack, if not undermined, if not in retreat. What can you say to our viewers today which might give them some glimpses of hope that it's not just a humiliating retreat for the rest of our days? Lois, what do you see in places like the EU and the UN that can give us some glimmer of hope?
Well, all we need to look at for our hope is the Bible, and we know that Jesus is going to have the victory on all of these issues. So that's the greatest source of hope. As for the EU and the UN, I would say that whilst challenges are getting harder, restrictions on freedom are growing, and the advocacy on against life and against a lot of the things that we hold dear is growing stronger. I also do see a lot of hope of particularly the UN countries starting to realize that they can raise a voice, that they can have an opinion, and it's okay for them to defend human rights. We saw that only last week, actually. 32 countries around the world joined together to sign what was called the Geneva Consensus Declaration, in which they affirmed that every human being has a right to life and that they were under no obligation to introduce abortion into their laws. And they were affirming human rights principles that have been agreed for decades. So I do see a lot of hope in that countries are beginning to stand up to this drip of institutional pressure that is very ideological. And I see it also in the number of people around the world that are increasingly engaged on the issue of life and on different issues. And we see that we're very encouraged. When we look to the future, we have training programs with ADF International, where we're looking to raise up the next generation of leaders. And every year we are able to see young professionals be strengthened and encouraged in their faith because of those programs. So there's a lot of hope, but a lot of need for prayer too.
Ryan, any hope for the UK?
There's an awful lot of hope in the UK. My experience is, I think when it comes to, let's say, members of parliament, a lot of them feel like if they stick their neck out on their own, or as a 2 or a 3, they're going to get eaten alive. And I think the key is providing an understanding that there is a critical mass of like-minded people out there. And there is in the House of Commons on most of the key issues. If you look at the life issue, for example, there's probably a good 150, 200 parliamentarians that are really solidly pro-life when you look at their voting record, and even more when you speak to them in person. So that's an awful lot it's just about having that confidence to know that others agree with you. And I think one of the things that's distorted our understanding of how good or bad things are is what you alluded to at the beginning, Kevin, which is that we're very headline driven and we're very social media driven, and it produces a constant anxiety as to how bad the world is and that things are traveling in a terrible direction, at least from a Catholic point of view, right? And actually, a lot of the time, when we actually do polling on some of the issues where we think everything's terrible, despite decades of top-down propaganda and pressure on societies, whether it be the UK or other countries like at the UN, we see that the vast majority of people are actually quite moderate or quite conservative on these issues still. And that, in fact, the House of Parliament or the media are not representative as to where the majority of the people are at. And I've had the number of conversations I've had with parliamentarians where, let's say on the life issue as a great example, 2% of women in the UK would be comfortable with the current time limit being increased. The vast majority of parliamentarians assume that the vast majority of women in the UK would be for that. And if you show them the polling that, in fact, 70% plus, I can't remember the exact figure, would like a reduction of some kind, they're genuinely surprised. And I think an awful lot of the work that needs to be done is just to encourage people to say, listen, your view isn't extreme, it isn't beyond the pale, it's not unusual for the House, and it's definitely not unusual for society as a whole.
I mean, that's an interesting point on the issue of abortion, because I know there's been an attempt to close down certain ways in which people engage on that subject. But I mean, it's a case, Lois, is it not, that on that subject in particular, once people are fully aware of what an abortion entails, the reality of it, that you can start to see minds changing almost automatically, whether it's through visual images or taking people through biological reality.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And different communication techniques work well in different situations. So I think there's a time and a place for more graphic images, and a time and a place for more comprehensive legal arguments, or using more uplifting stories about people whose mothers did not decide to go through with an abortion, and we can celebrate their life today. But I absolutely agree that most people would have their minds changed if they knew what an abortion really did entail. And that's why it's critical that we have pro-life doctors and pro-life media specialists and pro-life communicators and pro-life lawyers and every profession take the opportunity to speak out in their own way and into their own strengths to communicate that message. And I'd say Ryan mentioned that most of the UK would be more conservative than might be expected. Most of the world are more conservative than is expected. Yeah. Most countries in the world have, almost all countries in the world have at least some limit on abortion, whether that's a liberal one or a very conservative one. And many, many nations have cultures where they love children, love babies, and celebrate life. And having a big family, especially many African nations, is considered a wonderful thing. So we have to really bear that in mind as well when we're thinking about the future.
Is that one of the things that ADF International is one of its great strengths, is its ability to see beyond national boundaries? Because, you know, here in the UK, we could become very UK-centric when we discuss these issues, and you know, the trend is anti-life in so many ways, anti-family in so many ways, whereas, you know, to feel linked into a European-wide movement where these things are not exceptional, that there is a majority across Europe that adhere to these values, and have always adhered to these values. Do you think that's one of the other things that an organisation like ADF International can communicate and also advocate, that these are pan-European issues, they're not British issues, they're not French issues, they're issues that affect everybody in Europe, and that there is differing opinions and that they are equally as valid, and there's numerically there may be more in fact in favour with the type of views that you're proposing?
Absolutely, 100%. And we see that written right into the heart of the European post-war settlement, Kevin, in that, you know, whether it be the courts or it be other institutions like the European Parliament or the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, they're meant to pay close regard to the constitutional traditions of the member states of this continent. And the constitutional traditions of these member states are often explicitly pro-life, implicitly very pro-life, and definitely implicit very pro-family. You take the German constitution in terms of the kind of protection it gives for the dignity of not just human life in its text, but the use of human tissue is so carefully regulated in Germany, because they have that institutional, that national memory, rather, of what happened during the war. And they've remembered that we need to protect the dignity and inviolability of every single person. So when you see that, when you're experts in that European tradition that's still present and the institutions are at least supposed to pay heed to, it does give you confidence to speak that locally. And I do like to think that with our allies in the UK or in other kind of national contexts, we're able to provide that information and that confidence as well.
I mean, unlike the United States, where an identity, however loose, there is a kind of commonality and they have their federal system and the Supreme Court, we haven't quite, I don't think, achieved that across Europe. I mean, it's still very much around national governments. But just taking that last point, Ryan, when we see something as extreme as the proposed euthanasia law in Holland, where anybody under 12 can opt for euthanasia, do you ever feel that there is a pan-European pressure at any point on that national government which says this may be beyond the pale?
What we do see in situations like in Belgium or Holland is a widespread celebration, particularly places like the European Commission, European Parliament, Parliamentary Assembly, when it comes to Europe, and in the mainstream media, that this is something that is right and fitting. And when it suits, national sovereignty is often promoted as good and right. When countries go against the grain, like Poland on the life issue, for example, it's then seen as an unhealthy and extreme nationalism in that case. And there's an awful lot of institutional pressure, whether it be through mechanisms like the Commission or whether it be some of the big boys in Europe, to really put pressure at a diplomatic level on countries like Poland to cede this. Or there'll be penalties in broader areas like economics or how they're perceived worldwide.
That's right.
There's an awful lot of pressure to not stand out. And while some people might not like, I don't know, some of the tone, again, people disagree on this, of let's say, the political language in Poland or Hungary, I think for Christians in places like the UK, that's a real sign and symbol that there can be a platform, regardless of everything else, where family and life is put at the centre. And a Christian tradition is put at the centre, because that's not an immoderate thing in and of itself. And I think that gives an awful lot of hope that countries like Poland and Hungary are prepared to stand out against the zeitgeist in the media and stand out against the institutional bullying that they often come across, to be frank.
But Lois, isn't that precisely the problem that Ryan is identifying there? That you do have a situation where, like, Holland is bringing in laws which people may find barbaric, and yet Poland is bringing in laws which are the opposite in some regards. Yet the media tends to view them as we're saying in a totally different way. And isn't that precisely the problem, that the media spin on a lot of these things is creating its own narrative, which has inevitable consequences for various nations concerned?
Yeah, I would agree. That's definitely a huge challenge, especially with the Poland coverage recently. I was quite appalled after I had heard the good news, first of all, from a friend that Poland had decided to affirm the right to life of disabled babies to the same extent as their peers. I could not quite believe the coverage did not mention the word disabled in many of the articles,
yes, that's true.
And only focused on Poland bans abortion. And with pictures of protesters and nobody who was celebrating, and no mention of the wonderful consequences that this would have for people with Down syndrome across Europe, or people with clubfoot or cleft palate, who are often vulnerable to these laws. So I think it really is a huge problem with media spin, and that's why organizations such as ourselves and our network of allies and other communicators across Europe have to be unified in using the positive language in these cases to get a message of hope, to show that we're not that the message is not Poland bans abortion, but Poland supports life, and to get that into the mainstream media. So that is the challenge that is before us, and what the next step is finding the right journalists in the key places and making sure these messages get through. But I see a lot of hope in the messaging that can come across.
Well, our Euro Express is pulling into its platform now, and I wish to thank you both, Lois in Vienna and Ryan in London, for your contribution. But I'd also like to thank you for your energy and your courage and your tenacity in the face of so much opposition, to continue to help people understand what is the true, the good and the beautiful, and ultimately to create a better Europe for all its citizens to live in. We support you and wish you all the very best in your work. So on this trip we've come to an end, but I do hope you'll buy return tickets one day and come again for another chat, and keep us updated on all the work that you're doing across Europe, and helping us stay positive and stay focused as well about the issues ahead. We're not naive about the problems we face, but I think, Lois, you summed it up. Anybody who's read the last page of the Bible knows that it ends well. So on that point, I wish you well, and thank you very much for coming on board.
Thank you,
Kevin.
It's been a pleasure.